I am very pleased that our final speaker is James Stewart. I first met James Stewart on Twitter, which is not the best way to meet anyone, but in this case, I think it was a good way. He stuck out to me as this just incredibly sober, thoughtful, generous spokesperson who would show up in discussions about Canadian history a few years ago, at a point in which I think discussions about Canadian history on Twitter were horrible, and they were vicious and small-minded. And I subsequently left Twitter/X. I don't know if he's still on there. I think he is. But I was very impressed. He was a teacher at the time at Bishop Strawn School, I believe. And unlike your typical teacher, he was writing books. And he was writing a book called Being Prime Minister. And I understand he is today writing another book, which is well on its way, on a single-volume book on Canada's prime ministers. And I'm very pleased we have someone here to speak to us about John A Macdonald, but in particular John A Macdonald and how he's taught in the school system. Thank you.
Thank you, Chris, and David. Great presentation, both of you. So it's really an honor to be here tonight and to have Gordon Walker ask me to participate in this, and I certainly salute Gordon and his team of people who have brought us together under the guise of the Canadian Institute for Historical Education. And I think it's really important for us to have organizations such as this. And in my teaching career, I've also taught civics, and I speak to the students often about the importance of grassroots organizations, citizens being engaged and getting out and doing something about things they care about. And this institution is doing that kind of thing. You people attending and the folks at home watching online are part of what is really important in a democracy, to be able to have good discussions about important issues. Just before I get into the nuts and bolts of my remarks, as a teacher of history for 29 years, I wouldn't let a date like November 9th go by without saying, well, Saturday's Remembrance Day, and I think it's good for us to salute the soldiers who have served and made a sacrifice back to the Great War, up to the war in Afghanistan, the Second World War, the Korean War, peacekeeping. All of these things are an important part of what unites us as Canadians, and I think since that's on Saturday, I certainly wasn't going to let that go by unmentioned. And I know I'm getting into a little bit of a preamble before I've even mentioned the name Macdonald. But I was struck by an Andrew Coyne column in Saturday's Globe and Mail. A few people have been talking to me about it, and I wouldn't be surprised if a few of you are thinking, oh yeah, I read that one on Saturday. And he talked about the decline of a national consciousness in the country. And that's happening in provincial politics, it's happening in federal politics. But I would also argue that it's very related to what we're talking about today, because history is part of a national consciousness. And it's really important that organizations such as us and you on an individual basis, I know many people here are involved in history in other capacities of their lives. These little bits of awareness and advocacy are very important so that we can still have a national consciousness. And on that line of thinking, it reminded me of Jack Granatstein's book, which was published 25 years ago, Who Killed Canadian History? And Patrice Dutil spoke about that when he gave his address. And remember, Jack said in the book, someone who is walking around without an understanding of the nation's history, or a nation that doesn't understand its past, is like an amnesiac walking around the streets. You just don't know where you're from, and you don't know what you're about. And Patrice wrote an essay on the book in the latest issue of the Literary Review of Canada, a magazine he founded, by the way. And in that review, he talked about historians refusing to engage in public debates where they could add nuance to these important topics. I wonder when the last time was that we heard the word nuance talking about a debate in this country. And academics and other thought leaders need to show some courage and step forward and remind Canadians, if necessary, that there is nuance in the discussions of Canadian history. So I guess there's some connections between all of this sentiment and the history of Sir John A Macdonald. And this is why the group that we're here today is so important. And my connection as an educator is a big one, because I have been teaching kids for a long time and I've worked in schools, and I see how there's a serious, there's a lot of pressure on teachers. There's a lot of pressure on history teachers in particular, because a lot of these debates that you see happening out in Canadian society, or problems, people want schools to correct them. They want history class to correct them. And if I tell you a little bit about the pressure that's under there, is 3 years ago I wrote an article in the Globe and Mail, and it said, let's continue to be sure we educate ourselves about not only historical legacies, but also about the nature of history itself. And I think Chris's talk was bang on about talking about the nature of history itself. Let's not cherry pick the unsavory parts, but rather add contextual plaques to statues that explain the many facets to readers. The world is not black and white, and history is as gray as a late November sky. Well, I got called into the office by a senior administrator at my school when this piece was read. And I was asked about what were my classes like. And I needed to send documentation of the multiple perspectives that I used in my class, which I'd been using for my whole career. But this was the kind of climate that's out there. Then just a couple of weeks ago, I was in Montreal. Some of you might recognize this former statue, I guess. It's a plinth that has the word Macdonald on it. This is in Place du Canada in Montreal. But you shouldn't be able to see the Marriott Hotel through that plinth. You should be seeing the first Prime Minister of Canada. And of course I knew what had happened, but it was very real for me to see it, particularly with his name there, but the statuary missing. It was as though John A. Macdonald himself had just disappeared. And so these are some of the things, both these things, the issue of pressure on teachers, depending on what they say or write, taking down of statues. This is a misunderstanding of history. So is when we don't know about residential school history. And so both of these things are about not having a solid understanding of what has happened in the country. Happily, there are people who are contributing to change this. But isn't it kind of funny that you might remember the Dominion Institute was formed in 1998, and their mission was to promote Canadian history and get Canadians talking about it again. Well, it's 25 years later, and we're still talking about it. And there's probably some books from the 60s where people were still lamenting the state of history in Canada. But I have to tell you, you can't give up that fight. You can't give up that fight. And there's a quote from, I'm going to segue here into more Canadian history, but also into presentism. There's a new book on the railway, and it's by Stephen Bone. And it's a terrific book. And isn't it nice that there's more than just one book on the railway now? So we had the Great Burton books, and now we have Stephen Bone writing. But he said in his book, it's important to understand the decisions of historical figures within the context of their lives and times. What's right and what's wrong doesn't just depend on who you are, but when and where you are as well. Everything is changing all the time, including ourselves, including society. At some level in history, there is no good or evil, just what happened. David and Christopher both picked up on those themes. But you don't... okay. So now I'm going to talk to you about the curriculum in history across Canada. And don't worry, soon, I know when people hear the word curriculum, they're like, oh my God, get my phone out, I got to check my feeds, and I'm getting really tired. But if there's a job that a high school teacher is given, it is to take material that might not be that interesting and then get you really into it. And so I'm going to try to make this as interesting as possible. And I'm just going to do a flyby most of these provinces. These are the ones that actually require history at the secondary school level. I will spend more time on Ontario. And Gord told me, he said, "You're the last speaker, you get an hour and a half." And so I said, perfect, thank you so much for being the last guy to go. So Manitoba, you don't really need to read everything on there because I will give you the highlights. And Manitoba requires a history course in grade 11. I think they have quite a good course. One of the problems is they demand a lot of time periods to cover, which is kind of hard to do. But at least they are mentioning the big nuggets like John A. Macdonald, the railways, Quebec and Charlottetown conferences. These are big, important events in Canadian history. And then they also, interestingly, they say alternative approaches to organizing the content. And then apparently in Manitoba, you could teach it according to who was the Prime Minister at the time. You don't see that very often in schools anymore. Prime Ministers, what's that all about? I was at a school a few weeks ago. I was giving an address to the Model United Nations. And I mentioned that Lester B. Pearson, and I had the name labeled. I said, "Okay, kids, who can tell me who Lester B. Pearson is?" And none of the kids knew. I said, "Well, he won the Nobel Prize for Peace. He also went on to be Prime Minister." And I said to one of the teacher organizers after, I said, "Were you surprised that the kids didn't know who Lester B. Pearson was?" And the teacher said to me, "Well, no, nobody's really teaching the leaders anymore." I was like, "Oh my gosh, these things are happening." Because you can't, there's a de-emphasizing of teaching great men theory of history, but you are leaving out a lot of the nation's story if you're not teaching about the people who were making the decisions. I have another slide here which is kind of funny. Well, I have two more slides. This one I want to give credit to Manitoba for as well, because they are bringing in historical thinking here, where they're saying, talking about the past as a foreign country, which for a lot of students it is. I will often say to them, 2020 and 1920, the country's not the same just 100 years later. There's a lot of changes. But here you see an attempt at some kind of historical thinking by taking a historical perspective, and then they've brought forward some of the ideas that David was quoting that Macdonald had about Chinese people in Canada. I put this one on just for fun, because there's a couple of spelling errors for the sharp ones in the room tonight. Macdonald and Wilfrid are the two most commonly misspelled Canadian names in history. I see them all the time, and it stands out like a sore thumb. And also, those cartoons, they're great cartoons by Graham Mackay, who is the cartoonist for the Hamilton Spectator, so I'm using those with permission. So what about in Quebec and Nova Scotia? Quebec, ironically, is a province that teaches Canadian history over 2 years. So kids take it in grade 10 and grade 11, secondary 3 and secondary 4. Now, they're not going to drill down on John A. Macdonald, all right? Quebec is a société distincte, I'll say. I supported the Meech Lake Accord all those years ago. But at least it's in the curriculum. Indian Affairs, British North America Act, the national policy. It's there at least. Nova Scotia is a little bit different. They cover some of Confederation era in grade 7, but in grade 11 they also do it. And that's a required course in grade 11. And they have a little bit on Confederation. British Columbia, also interestingly in British Columbia, there's a grade 9 social studies course. And then students they have a choice for their grade 11 course. They can take a few different types of history, and one of them is Canadian history, but it starts in 1914. Grade 9 social studies, not a pure history course. There are other elements in it, but at least John A. Macdonald is there as some of the guiding questions for teachers to present to students, and some of the sample topics also speak to the history of John A. Macdonald. This leaves us to Ontario, which is the really fun one to deal with because there's some problems with Ontario's curriculum. And let's take a look at it. First of all, by the way, as you probably know if you've had children, there's only one course required in Ontario in Canadian history for high school students, and it does not include Sir John A Macdonald. Why? Because the Macdonald era is taught in grade 8 in Ontario. If you take a look at the Ontario curriculum, you'll see that Louis Riel is mentioned 7 times in the curriculum, and the founding father who built the railway and did some bad things too, but certainly an impactful member of Canadian history, he's mentioned 4 times. The one time he gets elaborated upon is to give this quotation when Macdonald said in 1983, Prime Minister John A. Macdonald stated that when the school is on the reserve, the child lives with its parents who are savages. Indian children should be withdrawn as much as possible from parental influence. That is the only elaboration on Sir John A. Macdonald. And I should let you in on a dirty little secret about teaching grade 8 history in Ontario. Sometimes it doesn't get taught very much because elementary schools are not credit-granting institutions in Ontario, so there is no accountability for what students need to do or what teachers need to do, no benchmarks to meet. In high school, you are granting a credit. There are certain things that must be done. And so in elementary school, you may well find that your child comes home from school and they haven't talked about history for quite some time. That's because, the teacher needed extra time for language arts. Also important, don't get me wrong. The teacher may have needed extra time for mathematics, that's true. Or the teacher might not be a trained historian and maybe is just, avoiding it because it's a little bit more difficult. So what if the teacher goes to the curriculum document for some guidance, which is what the curriculum documents are for? They are not a paint by numbers, they're a guidance. If the teacher goes to this, they say, well, look, John A. Macdonald, who would say that? That's terrible. I guess we better find out a little bit about how terrible he was. And then we'll ask some of these questions. But you won't see this in the curriculum. When Macdonald was bringing forward the franchise bill in 1885 and said, there's 120,000 of these people who are virtually and actually disfranchised, who complain and justly complain that they have no representation. We see here in another screen grab from the curriculum that these questions here are really, the last question is about the railway. And it says, how did the construction of the Transcontinental Railway interfere with First Nations and Métis trade and economies? It doesn't say, was the building of the railway necessary to link the country from sea to sea? It doesn't say, did the railway build an idea of Canada that didn't exist before a railway was built? It didn't say, what would happen if the country didn't have a railway? It just wants to ask what happened to the First Nation and Métis people. That's an important question, don't get me wrong. Of course it's an important question. But if you're going to give this curriculum document to teachers to take a look at, then perhaps a balanced perspective would be more effective so that we can do a better job of educating our young people. Remember, Christopher said, what do we owe the past? I like to think, what do we owe our students with the past? And it's to give them an education of what the country was about. So as I was saying that after you get to grade 10, you start your war or your history studies in 1914. So you go from grade 8 when you're 13 years old. You may or may not get a very good education in the subject. It really does depend on the teacher. I would worry less about class size and more about how able your teacher is in the classroom. And of course, there's great history teachers who teach grade 8 history in this province, and I know some of them. But it's not a universal thing where, at least in a public school, in a high school, you are likely to be taught by someone who has a degree in history. So you go through 1914, you get great education in 20th century history. But here's the problem. Right now, everyone is focused on reconciliation, and rightly so. There are a lot of debates about Sir John A Macdonald and other events during that period. So why don't we have 2 courses in Ontario? For kids who, when they're in grade 10, we can look at Part 1, 1867 to 1939, deal in depth with some of the big questions of our time and some of the fundamental things that are part of the country. And then in grade 11, we can do 39 to the present, or as far as you can get. That's a really important part of the solution, in my view, because there's nothing more important. I used to tell parents when they'd come in on curriculum night and they come in to find out what's my kid learning this year, and I'd say, look, this is probably the most important course your kid is going to take over the next 4 years. And some people chuckle a little bit because they might think English or science is more important, but history is actually, it's the only course they take. And remember, there's such an emphasis on STEM in high schools right now. And we're losing, part of that reason we don't have the national consciousness and people are losing a sense of what the country is that enrollment is declining in the humanities at the post-secondary level. They're not being promoted in the high schools. And so it's a hollowing out of the soul of the nation, because how do you know what you're all about if you don't know your past? I sometimes tell students, if you were going out with someone and you wanted to know them, what would you do? So, we'd go out, and I said, well, you'd probably ask them a few questions, wouldn't you? Yeah. What were your parents like? Do you have brothers and sisters? Do you have grandparents? What were they like? Where did you used to live? What was that like? You would be curious to the point that's being raised up today, the importance of curiosity. You would find out those things so you could get to know them. Well, it's the same thing with Canada. Ask questions about Canada. Try to find out what it was about. I really liked this book, Dominion, by Stephen Bone, and happily it appears to be selling well from what I hear, because I think Canadians do like history. But it's important that we have a nuanced and balanced view of it. And so this other quotations from his book where he says, it seems an odd and meaningless analysis to judge people by criteria they were unaware of during their lives. People live with their time and era, and to measure anyone against another or later culture and era is pointless. Thank you so much for coming out and listening at home, folks.